The early morning sun streamed through the narrow windows of Tom's bistro, casting long shadows across the tables where only a handful of regulars sat sipping their coffee. The low hum of conversation and the clinking of cutlery on porcelain seemed far from the storm that was brewing just outside the restaurant's doors. Inside, Tom had his hands full. This was the quiet before the chaos, the calm just before the proverbial storm. Tom Turner, the owner of Tom's Bistro, was a man of routine, a creature of habit. He had opened the restaurant nearly 15 years ago with dreams of turning it into a beloved local spot. And for a while, it had been exactly that. People came for the warm atmosphere, the delectable aromas that wafted from the kitchen, and the personal touch Tom provided to each and every guest. However, the past few years had been far from kind. Rising rents, fierce competition, and the ever-present shadow of failure loomed large over his once thriving business. Each day felt like a battle, one he wasn't sure he was winning. Tom had tried everything to bring the bistro back to life: new menu items, advertising campaigns, even special promotions. But nothing seemed to work. The debts piled up higher and higher, and Tom found himself sinking deeper into a pit of frustration. His regular customers, those familiar faces who had once been so loyal, had started to dwindle. Some came less frequently, while others had stopped coming altogether. It felt like no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop the tide from pulling him under. And then there was his son, David. At just 10 years old, David was Tom's world, his reason for getting out of bed every morning, even on days when it felt like the restaurant might be his last hope. But lately, Tom had noticed the toll the stress of his failing business had begun to take on his son. David had always been bright, curious, and full of life, but lately, his once bright eyes had taken on a more distant look. He no longer seemed to care about going to school or hanging out with his friends. Instead, he spent most of his time at the restaurant, sitting quietly at the corner booth, playing games on his phone or scribbling aimlessly in his notebook. Tom often wondered if the burden of his business had somehow started to weigh too heavily on David, making him feel the pressure of his father's struggles. But today would be different, or at least, that's what Tom kept telling himself as he wiped down the counter for the third time, rearranging the menus as if they were the source of his problems. Today, he had promised David they would spend some time together, away from the restaurant. The plan was simple: grab lunch at the park, play some catch, and hopefully lift his son's spirits. It was a fleeting hope, but it was a hope nonetheless. Tom just needed a break from the constant worry that gnawed at his every thought. Outside, a cool breeze whipped through the streets, carrying the faint scent of autumn. The restaurant doors opened, allowing the wind to rush in for just a moment before the bell above the entrance jingled and the door slammed shut. A woman entered, disheveled, worn, and carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Her clothes were threadbare, and her face, though striking, was weathered by time, hardship, and life on the streets. She was tall and thin, with a few stray strands of wild hair escaping from under her ragged hood. Her eyes, however, were sharp, too sharp for someone who had clearly lived through so much suffering. They darted around the restaurant, searching for something, anything, before they settled on David, sitting at the corner booth. Tom barely noticed her at first. He had become accustomed to the occasional passerby entering the bistro, the ones who wandered in for a coffee or to ask for spare change. It wasn't uncommon for the homeless to drift into the area, looking for a warm place to sit or a momentary reprieve from their daily struggles. But something about this woman struck him. There was an intensity in her gaze, a silent urgency that seemed to pull him toward her. He couldn't explain it, but it was almost as if she was drawn to David, not out of curiosity, but because she recognized something in him, something that she needed to address. Without a word, she made her way toward David's table, sitting down uninvited across from him. Tom's instinct was to intervene, to ask the woman to leave, but he hesitated. Something inside told him this was no ordinary situation. For a moment, the two sat in silence. David didn't even glance up from his phone. The woman, though, seemed to be studying him carefully, observing him in a way that made Tom feel uneasy. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could utter a word, it happened. David gasped, his face turning pale as he dropped his phone to the table. His breathing became erratic, and his hands began to tremble. His eyes widened in panic, and he clutched at his chest, as if trying to hold something inside that was threatening to burst free. The woman didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. In one swift motion, she was on her feet, pushing David gently back into his seat. "Stay calm, kid," she said in a surprisingly calm voice, her hands already moving with practiced precision. "Just breathe, all right? Help is coming." Tom froze, his heart racing in his chest. He wanted to move, to call for help, but his body wouldn't respond. The woman, though, was in full control now. She shifted David's body slightly, positioning him in a way that allowed her to begin CPR, even as she ordered one of the restaurant employees to call an ambulance. She worked with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, and often. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, David gasped for air, his chest rising and falling as he took in his first full breath since the episode had begun. The woman never took her eyes off him, never wavered, until she was sure that he was stable enough to breathe on his own. Only then did she step back, letting out a long, slow breath of relief. Tom, who had been rooted to the spot in shock, finally managed to find his voice. What happened?" he stammered, his hands shaking as he rushed to David's side. He could see now that his son was slowly regaining his color, but the fear still lingered in his eyes. "I'm not sure," the woman replied softly, glancing over at Tom. "I've seen it before. Sometimes, people forget to breathe, or their heart skips a beat. But he's all right now." Tom turned his gaze to the woman, his mind racing. She had saved his son's life. He didn't know her name, didn't know who she was, but she had done something he could never repay. She had taken charge when every instinct told him to panic. She had acted swiftly, without hesitation, in the most critical of moments. His heart ached with gratitude, but there was something else, too, an overwhelming feeling of being humbled by someone who had nothing, yet had given everything to save his son. "What's your name?" Tom finally asked, his voice hoarse. The woman met his gaze, a slight, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. "Sarah." And just like that, the course of Tom's life, and his business, was about to change forever. Sarah's intervention had saved David's life, but Tom wasn't thinking about his business, his debts, or the struggle he faced every day to keep his restaurant afloat. All he could focus on was the woman who had saved his son, this stranger who had walked into his life with nothing but the clothes on her back and a deep well of knowledge and composure. The paramedics arrived shortly after, and within minutes, David was in their care. Tom couldn't tear his eyes away from Sarah, who stood at the edge of the crowd that had gathered in the restaurant, her presence both calm and unsettling. She didn't ask for any credit, didn't seek any thanks, she simply did what needed to be done. The ambulance pulled away, sirens wailing into the distance, and Tom was left standing in the quiet aftermath. His son was safe, for now. But Sarah had made the difference. Tom knew he should have said something to her, thanked her properly, but the words didn't come. Instead, he found himself pacing around the restaurant, his thoughts racing. What if David hadn't made it? What if he had lost him today? He couldn't even begin to imagine a world without his son in it. His chest tightened with fear and guilt, but there was no time for that. His son was alive, and that was all that mattered. A few hours later, after Tom had spent time with David at the hospital and made sure he was going to be okay, he returned to the restaurant. He needed to process everything, to make sense of what had happened. As he entered, he saw Sarah sitting at the same corner booth where she had first approached David, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee. She had settled into the space as though she belonged there, her back straight, her eyes focused on something only she could see. Tom took a deep breath, steeling himself for the moment. He walked over to her table, uncertain of what to say. There was no script for this, no set of polite words that could truly express his gratitude. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice trembling with emotion. She looked up, her expression unreadable. "You saved my son today," Tom continued, his words coming out in a rush. "I can't ever thank you enough for what you did. You're a lifesaver." Sarah simply nodded. "It was nothing." "It wasn't nothing," Tom insisted, shaking his head. "You did something no one else could have. I've been in situations where I couldn't act fast enough, but you were incredible." She looked down at her hands, which were clasped together on the table. For a moment, it seemed like she might say something, but she didn't. Instead, she remained silent, as though she were weighing her next words carefully. Finally, she spoke. "I've been in situations like that before. I know what to do. People don't always take the time to learn, though." Tom didn't know what to say to that. There was a part of him that wanted to ask how someone like her had come to learn so much about life-saving techniques. She didn't look like a trained paramedic or a doctor, she was just a woman who had been homeless, someone who had survived on the streets. But the more Tom thought about it, the more it made sense. She had probably learned these skills out of necessity, surviving the hardships of life that so many others were fortunate enough never to experience. "I'm grateful, Sarah," he said finally, breaking the silence. "I'm not sure how I can ever repay you." Her eyes flickered, but she quickly masked any emotion with a calm demeanor. "I'm not looking for anything in return," she replied, her voice steady. "I just did what needed to be done." Tom nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Sarah's story than she was letting on. There was an aura of quiet strength about her, something that suggested she had lived through things most people couldn't even imagine. She wasn't the typical person who wandered into a restaurant looking for a warm meal or a kind gesture. She was different, there was an unspoken depth to her, a layer of experience that made her seem older than her years. "Tell me something," Tom said after a beat, his curiosity piqued. "What brings someone like you into a place like this?" Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't seem offended by the question. In fact, she seemed almost amused by it. She looked up at Tom, her gaze sharp, piercing, as though she were deciding whether to let him into her world or keep him at arm's length. "I've been around," she said simply, leaning back in her seat. "I've seen things. I've done things. But right now, I'm just trying to survive." "Survive?" Tom echoed, his brows furrowing. "What do you mean?" She shrugged. "Life doesn't always give you the opportunities you want. Sometimes, you have to make do with what you've got." She looked down at her hands, the fingers tapping rhythmically against the mug. "But I'm not asking for charity. I can work. I'm good with my hands. Good with food." Tom raised an eyebrow. "You're a cook." She smirked slightly, though there was a sadness in her eyes. "I've been cooking since I was a kid. Grew up in kitchens, learned how to make do with whatever I could find. It's what I know best." Tom felt a strange spark of recognition in his chest. His restaurant had always been more than just a business to him, it had been his livelihood, his passion, and his identity. And now, he was looking at a woman who had the skills to breathe new life into the place. She had no formal training, no culinary school degree, but the way she spoke about food, it was as though she could taste the potential in every ingredient, every dish. It was a feeling he hadn't had in a long time, not since the early days of the bistro when he first opened its doors. "I need help," Tom said, his voice soft but determined. He wasn't sure why he was offering this, but the words spilled out before he could stop them. "I need someone who can bring this place back to life. Someone who can turn things around. You know how to cook, do you want a job here?" Sarah didn't say anything right away. She simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. Tom couldn't tell if she was insulted or if she was simply weighing her options. The restaurant was small, struggling, and barely keeping its head above water. It wasn't much. But to Tom, it was everything. "I can't pay you much," he added, his voice hesitant. "But I can offer you a chance. A place to work. Maybe this is a second chance for both of us." Sarah studied him for a long moment, her gaze unwavering. Finally, she gave a slight nod. "All right," she said, her voice low but sure. "I'll give it a try. But don't expect miracles." And just like that, Sarah went from a stranger who had saved his son's life to a member of Tom's team. From that day forward, Sarah became an integral part of Tom's Bistro. She didn't immediately take charge. Tom wasn't ready to hand over control, but it was clear that her presence had an undeniable effect. Her cooking brought a spark back to the kitchen, and soon, the restaurant began to show signs of life again. Slowly but surely, the dishes she created began to attract attention. Her unorthodox methods, born from necessity, turned out to be exactly what Tom's Bistro needed. People started talking, spreading the word about the mysterious new chef who had appeared out of nowhere. The more Sarah cooked, the more she took charge. And with every dish she served, Tom felt the weight of his past failures begin to lift, just a little bit at a time. What he didn't know, though, was that Sarah's arrival would not only change the course of his business, it would alter the very fabric of his life and the life of his community. Over the following weeks, Sarah's presence in the kitchen became more and more dominant. At first, Tom had been reluctant to let her take full control of the restaurant. It wasn't that he didn't trust her, it was more that he wasn't sure he was ready for the changes she might bring. His restaurant had been his pride for so long, even if it was slowly crumbling under the weight of debt and dwindling customers. He was holding on to a version of the bistro that no longer existed, while Sarah was showing him a version of the future that he couldn't ignore. Sarah didn't hold back. Her cooking was transformative. Word spread quickly through town about the new chef who had taken over, and slowly but surely, the empty tables began to fill up again. People who had once been regulars but had drifted away came back, drawn by the new energy Sarah brought into the kitchen. Tom watched in amazement as she effortlessly whipped up dishes that not only tasted better than anything the restaurant had served in years, but also connected with people on a deeper level. The flavors were bold but comforting, familiar but with unexpected twists, just like Sarah herself. Yet, as Sarah's influence began to grow, so did the tension between her and Tom. She wasn't content just working behind the scenes, as Tom had expected. She had ideas, big ideas, about how the restaurant should be run. She pushed him, questioned his methods, and often disagreed with the way things had been done. But what she lacked in tact, she made up for in results. Every dish that left the kitchen was a testament to her vision, and soon the place was thriving. She had a way of making every meal feel special, like a piece of herself was embedded in each bite. Tom, on the other hand, was more reserved. He had spent years running his restaurant a certain way, and Sarah's unfiltered suggestions often challenged everything he knew. At first, it felt like a threat to his authority. He would question her methods, sometimes to the point of frustration. But when he saw the way the customers responded to her food, he couldn't argue with the results. Slowly, he began to accept her ideas, one by one, and a silent agreement was formed between them. It was clear that Sarah's strength lay in her unconventional approach, while Tom's was in his experience. They balanced each other, though neither of them was ready to admit it yet. One particularly busy evening, when the restaurant was packed and the pressure was on, Sarah caught Tom by surprise. He was struggling to keep up with the orders, his mind running in 1,000 directions. He was used to doing everything himself, managing the front, checking on customers, making sure everything ran smoothly. But as he walked into the kitchen, he saw Sarah in the middle of a chaotic scene, working calmly as though she were in complete control. She didn't need his help. She didn't ask for his permission. She was running the show, and he was simply there to observe. "Tom," she said without looking up, her voice steady but sharp. "We're behind on appetizers. I need you to talk to the front and get them to adjust the flow." For a moment, Tom stood frozen, taken aback by the confidence in her voice. This wasn't the Sarah he had met weeks ago. This was a woman who had taken ownership of something far bigger than herself. She wasn't just the cook anymore, she was the heartbeat of the restaurant. And he realized, in that moment, that he wasn't just a bystander to her transformation. He was a part of it. He didn't argue. Instead, he did exactly as she asked, stepping up to the front to direct the staff, adjusting the flow of orders, making sure that everything was coordinated. As he returned to the kitchen, Sarah gave him a brief nod of approval, and Tom couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride. It was the first time he had truly seen her in charge, and it was clear that she had the skills, the intuition, and the drive to take the restaurant to places he never thought possible. The restaurant, for the first time in a long while, was thriving. Business was booming, and Tom could feel the weight of the old days starting to lift. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was beginning to dream again. But with success came new challenges. Sarah's influence was undeniable, and soon enough, Tom found himself facing the inevitable truth: the restaurant's future was no longer in his hands. It was Sarah who was steering the ship now, and while he knew it was what was best for the business, it also felt like he was losing control of something that had once been his entire life. As the weeks passed, Sarah's relationship with Tom became more complicated. They began to argue more frequently, each of them trying to assert their vision for the future of the restaurant. Tom was reluctant to let go, but Sarah was determined to make the restaurant a place that not only served great food but also represented something larger, a sense of community, a place where people could come together, share stories, and feel like they belonged. For Sarah, the restaurant wasn't just a business. It was a way to prove that she was more than her circumstances, that she had something valuable to offer the world. One evening, when the last customer had left and the restaurant was finally quiet, Sarah sat down across from Tom at the bar. They hadn't spoken much during the evening, both of them wrapped up in their own thoughts, but now the silence between them was thick with tension. "Tom," Sarah began, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "I know you're struggling with this. I know it's hard to let go. But you have to trust me. We both want the same thing. We want this place to succeed. We want it to mean something." Tom ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts racing. He wanted to trust her, he did. But the idea of handing over something so precious to someone who had only recently walked into his life was terrifying. What if it didn't work? What if he lost everything he had worked for? "I don't know if I can," he admitted, his voice raw. "I've worked my whole life to keep this place afloat. It's not just a business, it's everything to me. And I've been holding on so tight for so long, I'm not sure I know how to let go." Sarah studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, without saying another word, she got up and walked over to the kitchen. Tom sat there, alone in the quiet space, his mind spinning with uncertainty. A part of him knew that Sarah was right. The restaurant needed a new vision, a fresh approach. But could he really trust her with it? Later that evening, after Sarah had finished in the kitchen, Tom approached her. "I'm willing to try," he said, his voice firm but hesitant. "But we need to be on the same page. This place, it's ours. But it's still mine too. I won't give up control completely." Sarah gave him a small smile. "That's all I ask. We'll do this together." And so, the partnership between Tom and Sarah was sealed. They didn't know what the future would hold, but one thing was certain: their lives, and their restaurant, would never be the same again. As Sarah took her place as the heart of the kitchen and Tom focused on the business side, the bistro began to transform into something far more than either of them could have imagined. It was more than a restaurant now, it was a symbol of second chances, of redemption, of the unexpected places where hope could bloom. But just as they started to find their rhythm, a storm was brewing on the horizon, one that would challenge everything they had worked so hard to build. The steady growth that the restaurant had experienced under Sarah's leadership had been an unexpected blessing. Tom had started to let go, more than he thought he could, and as the days passed, they found a rhythm in their partnership. But as quickly as the restaurant began to thrive, things began to take a sudden and unexpected turn. It started with a subtle shift. A regular customer walked in one afternoon and immediately looked uncomfortable. The look on his face was hard to read, but it was clear he wasn't happy with something. At first, Tom thought it was just a mood, a passing phase, but then it happened again. And again. And soon, other customers started to express similar concerns. They didn't like the new direction the restaurant was going. They missed the old menu. They longed for the familiar dishes that had been staples in the restaurant for years. They began to ask for Tom more often, and the tension in the air grew thicker with every passing day. Tom tried to dismiss it at first, chalking it up to the usual resistance to change. He had been through hard times before. The restaurant had always pulled through, no matter how many bumps in the road they hit. But this was different. The old patrons who had been loyal for years were starting to drift away, not just in numbers, but in their demeanor. It was as if they were disappointed in the choices he had made. And even though Sarah's food was getting rave reviews, it felt like something was missing. Tom couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he had done something wrong, something that had pushed away the heart and soul of the restaurant. The tipping point came one Friday night, when a particularly vocal customer, a longtime regular who had been coming to the restaurant for nearly a decade, stood up and shouted across the dining room. His voice was loud enough to make everyone stop what they were doing and look toward him. "This isn't the restaurant I've been coming to for years. This is not what I paid for," he yelled, his face flushed with frustration. The room fell silent, and Sarah, who was in the kitchen, could hear the heated exchange through the service window. She was used to criticism, it was part of the job. But this was different. This wasn't about the quality of the food. This was about something much deeper. The man's words hit Tom hard. The restaurant wasn't just a business to him, it was his legacy, a part of who he was. And now, it seemed like that legacy was being questioned in front of everyone he knew. Tom stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the situation sinking in. "Sir," he said calmly, trying to maintain control, "I understand your concerns. But we're trying something new here. Something different. If you don't like it, I'm happy to." "No," the man interrupted, his voice trembling with anger. "This is not what we came here for. You've let that woman take over everything, and now this place doesn't feel like home anymore. I want the old menu back. I want the old service. I want the old Tom's Bistro." The word stung, and for a moment, Tom could feel the weight of the criticism like a physical blow. But Sarah, who had just emerged from the kitchen, wasn't one to let someone attack their work without standing up for it. She stepped forward, her eyes locked on the angry man, her voice cool but assertive. "Sir, the food is the same. The quality is the same. I'm still working the same kitchen, using the same ingredients, but with a new approach. If you don't like it, you don't have to come back, but we're not going to change just because you can't adapt to something new," she said, her voice carrying through the restaurant. The man scoffed, clearly taken aback by her boldness. "You don't belong here," he sneered. "You're just a homeless woman who got lucky. This restaurant was built by people like me. You think you can just waltz in here and change everything?" The words were harsh, and they hung in the air, heavy with contempt. Tom watched as Sarah's face tightened, but she didn't flinch. For a moment, it seemed like the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Tom stepped forward, placing a hand on Sarah's shoulder, but she brushed it off. She wasn't going to back down. "Listen to me," she said, her voice low but firm. I'm here because I've worked for every opportunity I've ever had. You don't know anything about me, and I'm not here to prove myself to you or anyone else. But I'll tell you this, I will not let anyone disrespect me or the work I've put in here." The man sputtered in anger but didn't know how to respond. His pride had been wounded, and there was nothing more dangerous than a man who felt humiliated. Without another word, he stormed out of the restaurant, slamming the door behind him. The tension in the air didn't dissipate. It lingered, thick and suffocating. As the staff tried to go back to their tasks, the silence was deafening. Tom looked at Sarah, who was standing motionless in the middle of the room, her expression unreadable. "Are you okay?" Tom asked quietly, walking over to her. Sarah gave him a long look before nodding slowly. "Yeah. I'm fine. But that wasn't about me, was it?" Tom hesitated, but then nodded. He couldn't deny the truth. The problem wasn't Sarah's cooking. It wasn't even the changes she had made. It was the deep-rooted biases, the resistance to change, and the fear of something new that had been festering in the town for years. It wasn't just about the restaurant anymore, it was about everything that was wrong with the way people viewed others who were different from them. I think it's about more than just food," Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's about a lot of things people aren't ready to face." Sarah turned away, walking toward the kitchen as though the conversation had ended. But Tom couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. The next few days were filled with uncertainty. The town was divided. Some sided with Sarah, applauding her boldness and the restaurant's new direction. Others felt uncomfortable with the changes and began to boycott the place, insisting that it was no longer the restaurant they had known and loved. And in the midst of it all, Sarah and Tom found themselves at a crossroads. They could continue to fight for the restaurant and the community they had built, or they could let the tensions tear everything apart. What was the price of success? Was it worth risking everything they had worked for just to prove that they could survive the challenges of a changing world? As the days turned into weeks, Tom found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about business, about community, and about his place in the world. Sarah, too, was grappling with her own feelings of isolation and uncertainty. She had saved Tom's son's life, and in return, he had given her a second chance. But was that enough to hold on to everything they had fought for? The restaurant wasn't just a place to eat anymore, it had become a battleground, where old ideas clashed with new ones, and where people were forced to confront their deepest fears about change. As Tom stood at the restaurant's door one quiet evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant colors, he knew that whatever happened next would be a defining moment, not just for the restaurant, but for everything they had come to represent. And the question that hung in the air, unanswered and unresolved, was whether they would be able to navigate the storm together or if this would be the breaking point that would end it all. The tension that had engulfed the restaurant over the past few weeks reached a boiling point. The debates about Sarah's leadership and the direction of the business had spread beyond the confines of the kitchen and dining room, spilling over into the community. Gossip had reached every corner of town, some praised Sarah's innovative approach, while others condemned it as an affront to tradition. The town, once a peaceful and close-knit place, was now divided, with old loyalties tested and new allegiances forming. The question wasn't just about food anymore, it was about identity, about what it meant to belong, and about who had the right to change the fabric of a community. Tom felt himself torn between two worlds. He loved Sarah. She had saved his son's life, something that he would never forget, and she had shown him a new way of looking at the restaurant, breathing life into a business that had been slowly dying. But he also understood the old ways. The restaurant had been a part of this town for decades. People came here for comfort, for the familiar. But now, that familiarity was slipping away, and with it, his peace of mind. It wasn't just about the food or the menu anymore, it was about the heart and soul of the place. Every night, the restaurant became a battleground. On one side, you had Sarah and the loyal group of customers who appreciated the change, who reveled in the bold new flavors and the innovative menu. On the other, you had those who resented what they saw as an invasion, an outsider taking over something they felt was theirs. And in the middle stood Tom, caught between his love for Sarah and his responsibility to a community that had helped build his success. The situation grew even more complicated when Sarah began to notice a change in the staff. Her confidence and authority in the kitchen had turned her into a force to be reckoned with. But that power also came with its own set of challenges. Some of the waitstaff began to feel uncomfortable with her leadership. There were whispers in the back rooms, uneasy glances shared between the servers when Sarah wasn't around. They didn't know how to take her. She was different, strong, independent, and her presence commanded attention. In many ways, she was nothing like the previous chefs who had worked in the restaurant. They had been content with maintaining the status quo, but Sarah had come in with a fire to change things, and that fire had set the entire staff on edge. There were murmurs that perhaps the tension was too much to bear. A few of the servers had already left, citing too much stress or differences in vision. The kitchen staff, once a team that worked in perfect harmony, had begun to fracture, with some siding with Sarah and others still loyal to the way things had been before. The restaurant was on the brink of falling apart from the inside, and Tom could feel it. He had to make a decision. He had to choose whether to stand by Sarah, to protect the changes she had made, or to let the restaurant return to the way it had been. But how could he, after everything Sarah had done for him and his family? How could he betray her, after the sacrifice she had made? The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening when Sarah walked into the dining room to find a couple of old regulars sitting at their usual booth. They were loyal customers, some of the restaurant's biggest supporters over the years. But as she approached them, she could sense something was off. Their faces were hard to read, and there was an uncomfortable silence in the air. Sarah tried to put on a smile as she greeted them, but the awkwardness between them was palpable. "We were hoping to speak to Tom," the woman said, her voice low and tinged with discomfort. Sarah tried to hide the hurt she felt from the words. Tom had always been the face of the restaurant, the one customers trusted. But now, they were bypassing her, wanting to speak directly to him. Her stomach turned, but she nodded. "Of course," she said, excusing herself and heading back to the kitchen. The door to the kitchen swung shut behind her, and she leaned against the counter, breathing heavily. She had been working so hard, so tirelessly, to prove herself to everyone, but it was clear that it wasn't enough. No matter how much she had done to save the restaurant, there would always be people who couldn't see her for what she was. The homeless woman who had earned a second chance, the woman who had walked into this restaurant with nothing, had made something of herself. But that was never enough for some people. It wasn't until Tom came back from speaking with the customers that Sarah found out what had happened. The regulars had made it clear that they weren't happy with the direction the restaurant was going. They missed the old menu, the old feel. They wanted Tom to take charge again, to return things to the way they had been. And Tom had listened to them. He had agreed that perhaps it was time to reconsider the changes Sarah had made. "I think we need to scale back a little," Tom said as he stood by the kitchen door, looking at Sarah with a pained expression. "People aren't happy. They want the old Tom's Bistro back. They want comfort food, the dishes they've been eating for years. I think we might have to change things up again." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. She had worked so hard, had poured her heart and soul into every dish, every change, every new idea. And now, it was all falling apart. Her eyes burned with frustration, but she bit her tongue. She had known this day would come. She had known that the restaurant couldn't just be hers. It couldn't be her vision alone. The people of this town had their own ideas, their own traditions, and maybe they weren't ready for what she had to offer. "I get it," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "But I won't be part of something that doesn't believe in what we've worked for." If you want to go back to the way things were, then you're on your own. Tom's heart sank as he watched Sarah turn away. The weight of his decision pressed down on him. He had hoped it wouldn't come to this, that he could keep the peace between Sarah and the town, but it seemed inevitable. He had to choose. And no matter which way he turned, he knew someone would be hurt. The fallout from that night was immediate and swift. The next day, the restaurant was quieter than it had been in weeks. The old regulars returned, satisfied with the return to the familiar, but the energy in the air was different. It felt like the heart of the place had been ripped out. Sarah was nowhere to be found, and Tom was left to pick up the pieces of a fractured business and a fractured relationship. For the next few days, Tom found himself struggling with a deep sense of regret. He knew he had made the wrong decision. But it wasn't until he sat down to review the books that he realized just how much he had hurt Sarah. The financials were clear. While the old menu and old ways might have brought in steady customers, they weren't enough to keep the restaurant afloat. The business was dying again, slowly but surely. Sarah had breathed new life into the place, but Tom had been too afraid to let go. One evening, as Tom was closing up the restaurant alone, a familiar face walked through the door. It was Sarah. She didn't say a word but walked straight to the kitchen. Tom stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to say. Finally, he walked toward her, his voice almost a whisper. "I was wrong," he said simply, his voice filled with regret. "I should have stood by you. I should have trusted you." Sarah turned to face him, her expression softening. "I never wanted to be the one who tore this place apart, Tom. I just wanted to make it better. But I can't keep doing this if you don't believe in me." Tom took a deep breath, his decision finally clear. He had to make things right, not just for the restaurant, but for himself and for Sarah. They had both been through too much together for him to let fear dictate their future. "I believe in you," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "And I'm not giving up. Not now, not ever." And so, together, they faced the challenges ahead, not as a divided team, but as partners. Their journey wasn't over, but for the first time in weeks, Tom felt like they were finally on the same page. It was a new beginning. And this time, he was ready to fight for it. The following weeks were a period of reinvention, of fighting through the doubts and fears that had once threatened to tear everything apart. Tom and Sarah were determined not to let the restaurant slip away. It wasn't just about the food anymore, it was about proving to themselves and the community that change could be both revolutionary and respectful of tradition. They knew they had to walk a fine line, blending the old and the new in a way that felt authentic, and they were willing to put in the work. But the work wasn't easy. Despite their renewed commitment, the town still wasn't sure about them. The regular customers who had returned for the familiar menu began to voice their opinions more frequently. They didn't mind the occasional change, but they had grown attached to the old dishes, the ones that reminded them of long afternoons spent with friends and family in the cozy corners of Tom's Bistro. Many still saw Sarah as an outsider, no matter what she had done to save the restaurant, no matter how much she had proven herself. Her past still followed her like a shadow, and there were plenty of whispers about whether she truly belonged in the kitchen. But for every skeptic, there was also a supporter. Word began to spread about Sarah's cooking, how she had managed to create something fresh and exciting, without disregarding the rich history that Tom's Bistro had cultivated over the years. The new dishes had brought a spark back into the restaurant, and the bold flavors had become an unexpected hit. Slowly, customers who had once been hesitant began to come around. They realized that Sarah wasn't trying to erase the past, she was building on it. What began as a fierce debate over tradition versus change was now becoming a conversation about growth, adaptation, and the resilience of a business that had survived countless challenges. The staff, too, began to rally behind Sarah. The rift that had once divided the kitchen started to close as Sarah's leadership became more inclusive. She took the time to listen to her team, asking for their opinions and making them feel like they were part of something bigger than just following orders. She taught them how to experiment with flavors, how to push the boundaries of what the restaurant could be, but she also respected the wisdom that came with experience. Many of the older cooks, who had once been skeptical of Sarah's methods, started to see the merit in her approach. There was a growing sense of camaraderie in the kitchen, and that sense of unity was felt by everyone who walked through the restaurant's doors. But the true test came when Tom received an invitation to a prestigious local food competition. It was an event that could bring the restaurant much-needed publicity, but it also posed a significant challenge. The competition would showcase the best chefs in town, and it would pit Tom's Bistro against some of the area's most acclaimed establishments. The pressure was immense, and Tom knew that the stakes had never been higher. The competition wasn't just about winning, it was about making a statement. It was about showing the world that Tom's Bistro had a new life, and that Sarah, despite her rough start, was the future of the restaurant. Tom hesitated. The invitation was flattering, but it also made him nervous. The competition would be fierce, and there was no guarantee that they would succeed. What if Sarah's unconventional style wasn't enough? What if the judges didn't appreciate her bold choices? It wasn't just about the food, it was about their reputation, their legacy. Tom knew that if they entered, they would be putting everything on the line. But Sarah was determined. She saw the competition as an opportunity to prove herself, to show the town, and the world, that she belonged in the kitchen. She was ready to take charge, to demonstrate that her skills were more than just a product of her experience, they were a testament to her passion and dedication. She knew that the restaurant could win, but it would take hard work, creativity, and a willingness to push the boundaries of what they had done before. This was her chance to cement her place in the community, to show everyone that the changes she had made were not only necessary but worthwhile. Together, they decided to enter the competition, and the next few weeks were filled with long nights of preparation. The kitchen was a flurry of activity, with Sarah and her team experimenting with new ingredients, testing flavors, and refining every dish to perfection. Tom worked on the business side of things, making sure the restaurant was prepared for the potential rush of customers that would come if they won. The town watched with bated breath, eager to see how the once troubled restaurant would fare. The day of the competition arrived, and the atmosphere was electric. The air was thick with anticipation as chefs from all over the region gathered, ready to showcase their culinary prowess. Tom's Bistro, which had once been on the brink of collapse, was now a contender. And it was all because of Sarah. She had put everything she had into this moment, and now, it was her time to shine. As the competition began, the pressure mounted. The judges were tough, experienced chefs who had seen it all. But Sarah didn't flinch. She moved through the kitchen with the grace and precision of a seasoned professional, overseeing every dish and making sure that each plate was perfect. The kitchen staff worked tirelessly under her direction, and despite the chaos that always accompanies a live competition, there was a sense of calm. Sarah had become a force in the kitchen, and her team followed her lead with unwavering dedication. Finally, after hours of intense cooking and plating, the moment of truth arrived. The judges began to taste the dishes, and there was a palpable sense of tension in the air. Each dish was met with silence as the judges scrutinized every bite. Tom stood at the sidelines, watching anxiously. This was more than just a cooking competition, it was a chance to prove that everything they had worked for, everything they had built, was worth it. When the final dish was presented, there was a long pause. The judges exchanged glances, and for a moment, Tom's heart stopped. He had never felt such an intense mixture of hope and fear. The fate of Tom's Bistro, and Sarah's place in it, hung in the balance. And then, one of the judges spoke. "This is incredible," he said, his voice full of admiration. "This is not just food, it's an experience. The flavors are bold, innovative, and yet, they feel familiar. You've taken something traditional and turned it into something new without losing what made it great in the first place." The other judges nodded in agreement. There were no words needed. The team had done it. They had won. The victory was not just a win for Sarah, but for the entire restaurant. It was proof that the changes she had made were not only valid but necessary. She had taken a risk, and it had paid off. The restaurant was no longer just a place for old memories, it was a place for new possibilities. The victory marked the beginning of a new chapter for Tom's Bistro. The town began to take notice, not just of the food but of Sarah's place in the community. The whispers of doubt faded away, replaced by respect and admiration. In the months that followed, Tom's Bistro became more popular than ever. The restaurant flourished under Sarah's leadership, attracting not just locals but visitors from neighboring towns. People traveled miles just to experience the food that had once been seen as too risky, too unfamiliar. Sarah had changed the face of the restaurant, but she had also changed the town's perception of what was possible. She had shown them that sometimes, in order to honor the past, you had to be willing to take a leap into the unknown. Tom watched with pride as Sarah stood in the kitchen, confidently overseeing her team. She had come so far from the homeless woman who had walked into his life, and he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. She had saved his son's life, but she had also saved his restaurant, his business, and his heart. And as the town continued to embrace the changes she had brought, Tom realized that Sarah wasn't just the future of the restaurant, she was the future of their community. The obstacles they had faced together had only made them stronger, and the transformation of Tom's Bistro was a testament to the power of second chances, of resilience, and of the incredible things that could happen when people, no matter their past, were given the opportunity to lead. The story of Sarah, the homeless woman who had saved a child's life and taken charge of a restaurant, was no longer just a tale of personal triumph, it was a story that inspired the entire town. And it reminded everyone that sometimes, the greatest changes come from the most unexpected places.